Emily and Greg Sanders seemed like the perfect couple, until a secret affair, a deadly diagnosis, and a chilling betrayal unraveled their quiet suburban life and ended in murder. Greg and Emily Sanders had what many in their small Tallahassee neighborhood would call an ordinary but happy life. They had met in high school, bonded over their love for old rock music and late-night drives, and married shortly after graduation. Neither came from wealth, but they were hardworking and devoted to their growing family. Greg worked as a full-time mechanic at a local auto repair shop, while Emily had recently started working part-time at the nearby Walmart. With 2 children and a modest 3-bedroom house, they had built a quiet, stable life that looked, to outsiders, nearly perfect. People who knew them often described them as close-knit. Greg was quiet, but friendly, always helping neighbors fix their cars or mow their lawns. Emily was more outgoing, involved in school events and church gatherings. Their children, ages 6 and 9, were well-behaved and active in local sports. There were no obvious signs of trouble. They laughed at barbecues, posed for cheerful Christmas cards, and never missed a Sunday service. Friends often commented on how lucky they seemed, still together and in love after over a decade of marriage. But what people saw on the outside didn't tell the full story. Beneath the surface, cracks had slowly begun to form. Over time, the daily stresses of raising children, paying bills, and maintaining their home began to wear them down. Greg worked long hours to make ends meet, often taking weekend shifts. Emily, tired of being cooped up at home, decided to return to the workforce to contribute financially. That's when she took the job at Walmart, saying she needed a change and some independence. Greg supported her decision, never suspecting it would mark the beginning of the end. At first, the changes were small. Emily came home later than usual, often saying she had to help close or stay for inventory checks. She became protective of her phone, keeping it on silent and never leaving it unattended. When Greg asked about her co-workers, she gave vague answers, brushing off his questions as harmless curiosity. Still, he trusted her. They had built a life together after all. He never imagined she might be hiding something. Their relationship slowly began to shift. The warmth they once shared grew colder. Greg noticed Emily became easily irritated, distant during conversations and less affectionate. She seemed preoccupied, often staring off during dinner or spending long hours alone in their bedroom. When he asked what was wrong, she insisted it was nothing, just stress or fatigue. Greg wanted to believe her. He didn't want to admit, even to himself, that their once strong bond might be fading. Even the children started to sense that something wasn't right. They complained that their mother was always busy, or never smiling anymore. But still, Greg didn't push. He told himself all marriages go through rough patches. He blamed work, exhaustion, and the pressure of parenting for the emotional distance that had crept in. If he noticed that Emily barely looked him in the eyes anymore, he chose not to mention it. Denial, he thought, was better than confrontation. By the end of that year, Emily had transformed into someone Greg barely recognized. She wore more makeup, stayed out late more often, and was glued to her phone during every spare moment. Greg, exhausted from long days in the garage, retreated into silence. He didn't know what was happening, but deep down a feeling of dread had begun to take root. Something was unraveling. Still, no one on the outside saw it. To the world, they were still the perfect couple. Hard-working, committed, and grounded in family values. But behind their front door, a quiet storm was building. One that neither of them was prepared to face. It would only be a matter of time before the truth exploded into view, exposing a dark reality that would leave their family shattered forever. Emily's job at Walmart had seemed innocent at first. A part-time position to help cover bills and give her a sense of purpose outside the house. It was a new environment, filled with different faces and daily distractions from the monotony of her home life. For a while, she genuinely enjoyed it. She liked having her own money, her own space, and the feeling that she was contributing. But as the weeks turned into months, work became more than just a job. It became an escape. That's where she met Troy. He was in his mid-20s, a night shift stalker with a confident smile and a reputation for being a flirt. Emily noticed him immediately. He was funny, relaxed, and seemed to understand her in a way Greg no longer did. He didn't ask her about groceries or the kids or unpaid bills. With Troy, she wasn't a wife or a mother, she was just Emily, and she liked how that felt. At first, the connection was subtle. They'd laugh during breaks, share stories about coworkers, and occasionally text outside of work. But the chemistry between them grew quickly. What began as playful banter turned into lingering glances, and those glances turned into physical touches. Emily didn't mean for it to go any further. She told herself it was just flirting, harmless, exciting, and nothing more. But soon enough, they were meeting after shifts, sitting in Troy's car long after the parking lot emptied, until eventually they crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The affair gave Emily a rush she hadn't felt in years. It was reckless, thrilling, and full of secrets. She told herself it was temporary, that she still loved Greg, that this was just a way to feel alive again. But the truth was harder to admit. She was falling for someone else. And every lie she told to cover her tracks only pulled her further from the life she had built with Greg. What Emily didn't know, or maybe didn't want to know, was that Troy had a past. Rumors swirled around Walmart about his relationships, including one where he had supposedly infected a former partner with HIV. But no one ever confronted him about it, and Troy never mentioned anything. Emily didn't ask. She didn't want anything to ruin the fantasy they had created together. Their affair lasted nearly a year, hidden in plain sight. They used fake names on hotel receipts and took back roads to avoid being seen. Emily became an expert at lying, fabricating work emergencies, covering up late returns with made-up car trouble or store meetings. Greg, worn down by long shifts and growing uncertainty, never suspected the full truth. He thought Emily was just going through something. He had no idea that another man was sharing his wife's bed. Eventually, Emily began to feel sick. It started with fatigue, then strange fevers, and persistent infections that wouldn't go away. She thought it was stress or maybe a seasonal virus, but when the symptoms worsened, she finally went to the doctor for blood work. Days later, she got a call that stopped her cold. She had tested positive for HIV. The weight of the diagnosis hit her like a freight train. She sat alone in her car after the call, staring at the steering wheel in silence. Fear, guilt, and confusion overwhelmed her. How could this have happened? What was she supposed to do now? Emily didn't tell Greg. She couldn't. She convinced herself she would figure something out, maybe find a way to manage the condition without him ever knowing. But time was against her. She had already exposed him without realizing it. By the time Greg started showing symptoms, the damage had already been done. And just like that, the consequences of a hidden affair became irreversible. A disease had entered their marriage silently and without warning. Emily's secret was no longer just a betrayal of trust. It was now a matter of life and death. Greg had always trusted Emily without question. Their years together had built a quiet foundation of loyalty, and even as their marriage started to fray, he never truly believed she would be unfaithful. So when he began to feel sick, constant fatigue, aching joints, and a strange rash, his first thought wasn't betrayal. It was confusion. He blamed stress, maybe the flu, or even exhaustion from work. But as the symptoms worsened, Greg realized something was seriously wrong. The doctor's diagnosis hit him like a punch to the chest: HIV positive. He sat in stunned silence as the physician explained the results, listing off medications, possible treatments, and referrals. But Greg heard none of it. His mind raced, clinging to one fact. He had never cheated on Emily. He had never even thought about it. The only possible way he could have contracted the virus was through her. The woman he had trusted for over a decade. The woman he still slept next to every night. At first he refused to believe it. Maybe it was a mistake, a lab error. Maybe there was another explanation. But after multiple tests confirmed the diagnosis, denial turned into suspicion. He started looking back at the previous year with new eyes. The nights Emily came home late, her mood swings, her secretive behavior, the locked phone, the distance that had grown between them. Suddenly, it all began to make a terrible kind of sense. Greg became obsessed with finding out the truth. He waited until Emily left her phone unattended, and then he searched it. What he found shattered any hope he had left. There were messages from someone named Troy, hundreds of them, texts filled with affection, plans to meet, and conversations about times and places Greg never knew about. Some of the messages were explicit. Others were confessions of feelings that should have only belonged to Greg. And then there were photos. Selfies taken in parking lots, hotel room mirrors, and even one that showed Emily in a t-shirt Greg didn't recognize, lying in a bed that wasn't theirs. There was no denying it now. She had been cheating. And worse, she had exposed him to a virus that would alter the course of his entire life. Greg's shock quickly turned into rage. Not the loud, impulsive kind, but a slow-burning anger that dug deep into his bones. He didn't confront her, not yet. He couldn't. Instead, he began collecting his own evidence. He saved screenshots of the messages, copied photos onto a flash drive, and even took notes on her behavior. He felt like he was living with a stranger. Emily remained silent about the truth, either out of fear or denial. She acted like everything was normal, pretending not to notice the change in Greg's mood. But Greg had already begun to pull away. He stopped talking at dinner. He avoided touching her. At night, he stared at the ceiling for hours, imagining the moments she had shared with someone else, wondering how long she had been lying to his face. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Greg had ever felt. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the damage it had caused. His health, his trust, his sense of self. Everything had been ripped apart. And worse, Emily had said nothing. No apology, no explanation, no truth. As weeks passed, Greg became more isolated. He stopped seeing friends, stopped attending his kids' school events, and barely spoke unless necessary. The pain turned into something darker. He couldn't stop thinking about what had been done to him, not just emotionally but physically. He felt like he had been poisoned, murdered in slow motion by the person he once loved most in the world. And as that thought took root, it started to grow. He didn't want justice. He wanted retribution. Not in the courts, not through lawyers or therapy. He wanted something more direct, more final. The idea started as a whisper in the back of his mind, but each day it got louder, and soon it was all he could hear. The thought of killing Emily didn't come to Greg all at once. It crept in slowly, disguised at first as fantasies of confrontation, moments where he would finally scream at her, demand answers, force her to admit what she'd done. But over time, those thoughts shifted. Confrontation wasn't enough. Words wouldn't undo what she had taken from him. His health was gone. His trust was broken. His life had been reshaped by a silent, invisible sentence that he hadn't deserved. The woman he had built a future with had robbed him of that future, without even having the courage to confess. He began planning in secret, methodically and without emotion. He didn't see himself as a killer. He saw himself as a victim, taking back control. Greg had always been quiet, calm, rational. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't yell. But something inside him had fractured, and in the silence that followed, a cold, calculated determination took its place. He started small. First, he made sure the kids would be out of the house. A weekend trip to Emily's mother's place provided the perfect opportunity. Then he researched everything he could. How long it would take to strangle someone, how to make it look like a robbery, how to destroy fingerprints and remove traces of a staged scene. Greg read articles, scoured forums, and took notes in a notebook that he hid beneath his workbench in the garage. He didn't want to shoot her. Guns were loud, messy, and left evidence behind. He wanted something quiet, something that could be mistaken for a crime of opportunity. He settled on strangulation, personal, efficient, silent. It felt like the right kind of justice for what she had done. Slow, deliberate, painful. He bought a new phone charger cord from a gas station, something with no fingerprints, no connections to their home. He broke one of their basement windows days before the act and carefully taped it up, so it would look fresh on the night of the crime. He even took photos of their electronics and furniture to remember how everything was arranged before he trashed the place in a false struggle. On the night he chose, the rain came in steady sheets, drowning out sound and clearing the streets. Greg cooked Emily dinner. He poured her a glass of wine, acting calm, affectionate, as though nothing was wrong. Emily, possibly sensing a rare moment of peace, accepted the gesture with cautious relief. She had no idea what he was planning. To her, it was just another quiet night in a marriage that had long since lost its warmth. After they ate, Greg suggested they watch a movie in the bedroom. Emily agreed. She went to change into more comfortable clothes. When she returned and sat on the bed, he moved behind her, pretending to reach for the remote. That's when he looped the cord around her neck. She struggled. She fought. But Greg was prepared. He had rehearsed the timing in his mind again and again. When it was done, he stood over her body, breathing heavily, trying to steady himself. There was no turning back now. He spent the next hour staging the scene. He knocked over drawers, pulled open cabinets, and shattered the taped window to make it look like a break-in. He stole a few electronics and placed them in a trash bag in his truck, intending to dump them miles away to further sell the story. Then around midnight, he drove to a gas station nearly 30 minutes from their house, making sure to walk inside, buy a soda, and let the surveillance cameras see him. A perfect alibi. Greg returned home and waited. He called 911 an hour later, voice shaky but composed, claiming he had come home after running errands to find Emily dead. The police responded quickly, but he kept his story straight. He repeated his version to officers, detectives, and even the kids who came home the next day to a house full of yellow tape and unanswered questions. But the plan wasn't as perfect as he thought, and in the coming days, small mistakes would start to unravel everything. In the hours and days after Emily's death, Greg played the role of grieving husband with convincing precision. He cried when detectives asked about their relationship, repeated his alibi without hesitation, and expressed disbelief that anyone would target his wife. To outsiders, he looked broken, confused, and lost. Friends and neighbors brought casseroles and condolences, offering support and sympathy. His performance was almost flawless. But behind the police tape and memorial flowers, investigators were already noticing inconsistencies. The first red flag was the broken window. Officers quickly determined it had been smashed from the inside, not the outside as Greg had claimed. The glass pattern didn't match a forced entry. It looked staged. Next came the signs inside the home. The ransacked rooms looked too clean, too orderly. Valuables had been left untouched, while minor electronics, like an old laptop and a DVD player, were missing. It didn't feel like a robbery. It felt like a cover-up. Detectives grew suspicious and requested access to Greg's phone records. That's when the real cracks began to form. Search history from weeks prior revealed disturbing queries: how to fake a burglary, how to remove DNA from a crime scene, and the effects of strangulation. It was enough to warrant a deeper look. A search warrant for the home turned up even more. Hidden in the garage beneath a pile of rags and old tools, investigators found a spiral notebook. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, Greg's own words, raw and angry. He had documented his discovery of Emily's affair, her diagnosis, and the heartbreak of learning he was now HIV positive. The journal entries shifted in tone from grief to rage. One passage described a plan to take justice into my own hands. Another detailed a timeline of Emily's movements, noting which days she stayed late at work and how long she spent on her phone each night. Then came the final piece of evidence. A receipt found in Greg's truck linked him to the purchase of a phone charger cord, identical to the one used in the murder, dated just days before Emily's death. Combined with the lack of forced entry and his detailed internet searches, it formed a damning picture. Greg was arrested within a week. The community that once saw him as a devoted husband and father was stunned. Many couldn't believe it. Others, who had noticed his recent isolation and changed demeanor, began to see the signs they had previously missed. The trial that followed was swift and heavily covered by local media. Prosecutors laid out the timeline, the motive, and the chilling steps Greg had taken to carry out his plan. In court, Greg didn't show much emotion. He listened as the prosecution detailed his betrayal, the murder, and the attempt to deceive law enforcement. Witnesses testified about the quiet anger he carried, the way he had changed after Emily's diagnosis, and the cold logic behind his crime. His defense team attempted to argue diminished capacity brought on by emotional trauma and illness, but the evidence was overwhelming. Greg eventually entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder to avoid a life sentence. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison. During sentencing, the judge spoke about the tragic chain of events that had led to Emily's death, a mix of deception, untreated pain, and irreversible decisions. Emily's children were placed in the custody of her sister. They were told their mother had died during a robbery, a story meant to protect them from the full truth. For now, one day they will learn what really happened, how a hidden affair and a life-altering diagnosis led their father to do the unthinkable. What began as a private betrayal ended in public tragedy. A family was destroyed not by one single act, but by a series of choices made in secrecy, shaped by fear and driven by revenge. The perfect family that once smiled for holiday photos had become the subject of a case that would haunt their community for years to come.